My area of expertise and the thing I spend time studying about is the place of madness in culture. And I range very widely, both geographically and in terms of time. Recently, all the way back as far as ancient Palestine and ancient China, up through the very present. So I do cover an enormous temporal and geographical range, although I started out looking at the 19th and the 20th centuries. One of the things I believe about sociology is if it aspires to understand society, first of all, it must have a temporal dimension. And secondly, that its insights and its ways of thinking about the social world ought to apply just as much to a society very far away from ours in both time and space. So I've always been interested in the historical dimensions of sociology, and one of the things that attracts me to it as a discipline, besides its obvious interest in the social world around us, is how capacious it is. Of all the social sciences, including history, it allows us to range the most widely over the territory that interests me. And cultural things flow across boundaries much more readily. People flow across boundaries much more readily. The world is transformed sometimes by voluntary relocation, such as was the case when I moved to America, but it's also, as we see very vividly at the moment, also transformed by the problems of refugees, the outbreaks of conflict, and so on. So sociology can, in principle, speak to all of those issues and can speak to them, I think, in a humane and broader fashion than many of the more specialized disciplines. And that's really the special thing that I think the discipline brings when it looks at almost any subject matter, is that attempt to see whatever is in front of the particular lens at the moment in the context of a broader set of phenomena. But I think of education as creating somebody who's equipped to face novel things and ask the right questions when confronting them. And I think sociology does enable people to understand their world better and to think in perhaps a less knee-jerk fashion about what's going on around them. And that can be tremendously useful, that kind of lateral thinking, that ability to think outside the box, to maybe be aware of how in another society things might turn out differently, and therefore be aware of alternatives, which is something, as we move into a world characterized by a very great deal of social change, being able to cope with that, put it into some kind of context, is an enormously valuable skill. I think it's a department that's committed to high standards of teaching. I think one of the things that I think does mark it out and continues to mark it out is the range of societies that people are interested in, and the hearing that historical sociology gets, the interest in the real world and in real world problems. So I work on issues of mental health, which is something that touches an enormous percentage of the population, either directly or indirectly. There are people here who work on immigration, which obviously is one of the hot issues of the day. We have people working on the kind of social context of globalization, the impact of globalization. So there's a huge range of things. People working on law and the way law is embedded in particular social contexts. And so this is a department that ranges very broadly intellectually. It's quite eclectic methodologically, so that students can get a very good training in statistical analysis and quantitative techniques, but equally well, they can learn to be an ethnographic observer of particular social settings, or they can become a pretty serious historian. I spend a lot of my time working in archives, and when I work in archives, it's not so very different than when a historian's working in an archive, except perhaps that I contextualize what I'm seeing a bit differently than a specialist historian might.